Torah Studies Part 2. Last Shabbat, we finished with the adversary trying 3 times to coerce Yeshua into disgracing himself before his Father in heaven. It was another failed attempt by Satan to corrupt the sovereign plan of God. Yet again, Satan had failed, so he left Yeshua alone. So let's take up the story where we left off last week. Yeshua returns to Beit-Anyah. After he'd been in the wilderness for 40 days and tempted by Satan 3 times, he arrived back in Beit-Anyah, where Yochanan, the immerser, was still immersing, and all who came out to him with a genuine desire to turn back to God were immersed. It was during that time that Yochanan was immersing at Beit-Anyah that the Perishim, or Sadducees, challenged him, as it's recorded in Yochanan chapter 1, verses 24-25, by asking him what his authority was that he should be immersing people. But bear in mind, Yochanan was a Cohen, and he should have been at the temple, assisting people to go through the mikveh of purification before the 3 major festivals each year. But here he is, down beside the river Jordan, immersing people, dressed in camel hair and a belt around his waist. He looks nothing like a priest. So the Perishim were totally confused and puzzled, because earlier Yochanan had clearly stated that he's not the Messiah, he's not Eliyahu. He even denied being the prophet that they had been waiting for so long. He gives an answer which further confuses the challengers when he said, "I am immersing people in water. Standing among you is one who will come after me. I am not worthy to untie his sandal." None of them knew Yeshua at that stage as being anything more than just the son of a carpenter from Nazareth. They had no concept that he had been sent by El Elyon, God Most High. Because as it says in verse 29, the following day, Yochanan says, "Look, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world." Now Yochanan continues reflecting back on the day when he actually immersed Yeshua. And he said, "I myself did not know who he was, but the reason I came immersing with water was that he might be made known to Israel." Yochanan was correct when he said, "I did not know who he was." Even though Yochanan and Yeshua were in their mother's wombs, when their respective mothers met, the baby in Elishiva's womb, Yochanan leapt for joy because of the presence of Yeshua. But after their birth, they never actually met. Because at the time they were born, particularly after the birth of Yeshua, Herod the Great went on a rampage, killing all the boy babies in Bethlehem. At that time, Yochanan, or his mother, feared for his life also, and Elishiva fled to the hills east of the river along with Yochanan. At that time, Miriam and Joseph took Yeshua and went away to Egypt to escape from Herod's rampage. So you see, the boys never met each other. When Yeshua's family finally returned, they went, of course, to live in Nazareth. And Yochanan continued living somewhere east of the Jordan. So Yochanan was quite right when he said, "I did not know who he was." Yochanan continued explaining about the circumstances surrounding the immersion of Yeshua. As he says in verses 32-34, "I saw the Spirit coming down from heaven like a dove remained on him. I myself did not know who he was, but the one who sent me to immerse in water said to me, 'The one upon whom you see the Spirit descending and remaining, this is the one who will immerse with the Ruach HaKodesh. And I have seen and borne witness that he is the Son of God.'" Now there is no mention whether the Perishim accepted that explanation or not. There's nothing recorded. But as we see, as the ministry of Yeshua goes on, They obviously had not accepted what Yochanan was saying. However, the next day, when Yeshua appeared amongst the crowd yet again, two of Yochanan's Talmidim, or disciples, were also there present with him. And he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." Immediately, his two Talmidim chased after Yeshua, and sensing their presence, he turns around and said, "What are you looking for?" To which they responded, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" Yeshua said, "Come and see." And they spent the day with him. Now it appears that they may have stayed overnight with Yeshua, because it was around about 4 p.m, even though there's probably 3 hours more like daylight at that time of the year. So one of those two Talmidim went chasing off, that was Andrew, went chasing off to find his brother Simeon. Having found him, Andrew said to him in verse 41, "We found the Mashiach." So they went off together to the presence of Yeshua. In verse 42, Yeshua makes his first recorded prophecy when he looks at Shimon and says, "You are Shimon bar Yochanan. You will be known as Kepha," which means the rock. There is no further mention at this stage of the second Talmud of Yochanan. So whether this other Talmud went with him or went back to Yochanan, we don't know at this stage. But I think it is important to keep that in mind. We'll consider that in future sessions. However, before Yeshua sets off, he sees Philip and says, "Follow me." In verse 44, Philip was one who came from Beit-Anyah, in a town where Andrew and Kepha also lived. So maybe that's why Yeshua called him at that stage. Anyhow, Philip in turn finds Nathanael, who, when he was told, Yeshua ben Yosef from Nazareth, he is the one spoken about by Moshe and the prophets. Nathanael's response is quite skeptical, because he, like so many others, despised the people of Nazareth and various other parts of the Galil. That's why he said, "Can anything good come from there?" Nathanael could have been reflecting back to the year 6 CE, when Quirinius, the Roman governor of Yehuda, imposed severe taxes on the people of Yehuda. That was in response to the people's rebellion against Archelaus, the tyrannical son of Herod the Great. It was at that time that a man by the name of Yehuda of Gamala came from the Golden Heights region, and he rose up and claimed to be the Messiah and caused considerable disturbance throughout the region. As a further digression, that same Yehuda founded what became known as the Fourth Philosophy, a group who later became the Zealots, who were the ones that started the first revolt against Rome, and of course brought about the destruction of the Second Temple. So Nathanael was possibly justified in being skeptical about who Yeshua really was. Was he yet another troublemaker? But when Yeshua first meets Nathanael, Yeshua makes a very interesting comment. He says to him, "Here is a true son of Israel, nothing false in him." In response, Nathanael says, "How do you know me?" With something of an intellectual tussle. Nathanael makes another profound outburst when he says, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." However, Yeshua finishes that discourse with his words, "You believe all this just because I said I saw you under the fig tree? I tell you, you'll see greater things than that." Then he said to him, "Yes, indeed, I tell you that heaven and earth, heavens will be opened, and the angels of God will be going up and coming down on the Son of Man." While that statement is referring back, of course, to the patriarch Yaakov, who saw the ladder reaching up to heaven when he was dreaming, Yeshua gives no further explanation as to what the meaning of the angels going up and down on the Son of Man was all about. That has been left open to conjecture by many commentators, and it's never been clarified. Even after all that had been said, Nathanael was never mentioned among the 12 emissaries. Instead, he may well have been one of Yeshua's faithful followers. That is possibly confirmed by when he reappears in Yochanan chapter 21, verse 2. When Yeshua comes back after his resurrection, he meets his Talmidim and his emissaries. Nathanael from Kanah was actually gathered with the 6 of the emissaries. The whole exchange with Nathanael at Beit-Anyah took place the day that Yeshua was about to return to Galil. So it suggests quite likely that he was one that made the journey back to Galil with Yeshua. So while spending those 3 days in Beit-Anyah, having met Andrew and the unnamed Talmud of Yochanan, along with Shimon, Philip, and Nathanael, there is no indication that any of them went back with him to Galil. But it was common practice, of course, for people who traveled during that era to travel in groups for safety. They did not travel alone, so it's quite likely that Yeshua went with them. And when they got back to the Galil, they possibly dissipated and went back to their own occupations and places of residence. Now, the reason I say this is because when we go to Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 20, it says, Yeshua walked by Lake Kinneret, and he saw 2 brothers who were fishermen, Shimon, known as Kepha, and his brother Andrew, throwing nets into the lake. Yeshua said to them, "Come follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." At once they left their nets and went with him. Now that encounter is much later. They were actually at the shore of the lake after the arrest of Yochanan the immerser. Now that did not happen until well after Yeshua had returned from Beit-Anyah. So that's something we need to consider in a later session. So it appears that those Yeshua met at Beit-Anyah all went their own separate ways. Then, when Yeshua returned to the Galil, it's quite possible that he was with other unmentioned or unnamed people. That's why it explains later in Matthew that Andrew and Kepha were actually called to leave their nets at a later date. So let's move on and consider the water turning into wine. Having returned to the Galil, it appears that Yeshua may have possibly gone directly to that wedding. When we consider the distance between Beit-Anyah and Cana, where the wedding took place, it would have been about just over a 2-day journey for Yeshua. This I consider is important because most English translations of John chapter 2 verse 1 use the phrase on the 3rd day rather than Tuesday, which is found in the CJB. Now, if the 3rd day is referring to the period from Yeshua being at Beit-Anyah, it follows that he would have gone straight to the wedding after a 2-day journey. Now, my reasoning is confirmed by a group of commentators called the Bible Reference Com, which is an online project designed to analyze difficult verses such as Yochanan chapter 2 verse 1. Now, their website says on this matter, the 3rd day probably means the 3rd day after Jesus recruited Philip and Nathanael. It probably does not mean Tuesday, since the Jewish tradition was that a virgin bride marries on a Wednesday and widows marry on Thursdays. However, the wedding in Jesus' era was not a single-day event. Since the messengers and other travelers took time to move, it was hard to predict exactly when a person would arrive. A typical celebration would take a week. Now, the footnote there is the reference to the Wednesday and Thursday weddings comes actually from the rabbinical Mishnah. For those who are interested, they can look at the details more deeply. But clearly we see that this was a practice, that Wednesday and Thursday were the days of weddings in ancient Israel. Another reason why Yeshua may have gone directly to the wedding is also in chapter 2 verse 1, where it says, and the mother of Yeshua was there, which seems to suggest that Yeshua and his mother arrived separately at the wedding. So I'll skip over the details of the narrative of the wedding, because we all know the details of changing the water into wine, apart from a few select verses which appear to show the humanity of Yeshua. Firstly, when the wine ran out, his mother said, "They have no more wine." Yeshua responds by saying, "Mother, why should that concern me or you? My time has not yet come." Now, was he telling her that it was not his responsibility to determine when his ministry was to commence? Or were the words that she was saying a gentle prod from the Ruach HaKodesh? Having been immersed, was it time for him to start his public ministry? I think the way that his mother reacted to Yeshua's words speaks volumes, because rather than talking back to Yeshua, she instead speaks directly to the wedding servants and says, "Do everything he tells you." After she'd said those words, Yeshua really had no option but to embark on his first miracle. His earthly ministry had really begun. The second matter worth considering is in verse 11, where having performed that first miracle, the Talmidim, or his followers, who'd come with him to the wedding, suddenly had a reason to trust that he truly was the Mashiach, the one they had been waiting for. Because of his mother's words, his ministry had been launched. There was no going back. He could not undo what had happened. Now, through that first miracle, he was publicly announcing that he was the long-awaited Mashiach. After the wedding, Yeshua spent a few days in Capernaum with his mother, brothers, and Talmidim. However, none of the Gospels give us any details about those days together, nor any reason why they went to Capernaum instead of going back to Nazareth. After all, Nazareth and Cana were only 8 kilometers apart, but Capernaum was 35 kilometers in the opposite direction. Maybe it was because the family and friends had agreed to gather together in preparation for the long journey up to Jerusalem. Yochanan says in chapter 2 verse 13, it was almost time for the festival of Pesach in Yehuda, so Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Now, in accordance with the commands of Torah, all the people of Yehuda, regardless of where they lived, were required by Torah to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year for Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Yeshua was no exception. He always followed the mitzvah of Yahweh. So we'll see he celebrates all 3, the Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So next Shabbat, we will continue from Yochanan chapter 2 verse 13 onwards, and we'll follow Yeshua up to Jerusalem, and we'll see what transpires at that first Pesach of his earthly ministry. Shabbat Shalom.